Okay, so this week we're going to be doing something a little bit different, or I am, I guess. I'm going to be putting together a reading overview for you. Now, this is really just going to be an overview. I'm not going to go through each of our reading texts line by line or in any great detail, but what I'm hoping to do with this is just kind of go over some of the more pertinent things about each reading that we do for our weekly homework to make sure that I can clarify anything that might be a little bit difficult to understand or unclear in those readings so that we're all on the same page. So, with that goal in mind, we're going to move on. Okay, so the first reading I'm going to talk about is Adam Smith. We have an excerpt in your text. In my book, it's page 62 of The Wealth of Nations. It's published in 1776. And it is broadly considered to be, this text is broadly considered to be the foundation for what we might think of as modern capitalism. That philosophy or philosophical system. It is very much in step with Enlightenment philosophy writ large, I suppose. And it attempts to put those ideas, the notion that the universe is a rational place that works according to rational laws, into practical use to address economics instead of simply things like physics. And so it's an effort to take the idea that there are natural laws that govern the universe and use those natural laws or uncover what those laws might be as it pertains to economics or to money and finance. Now, a lot of this you're probably quite familiar with. You've heard it in one form or another very likely throughout your lives. But what Adam Smith puts forward is the basic idea that economics work according to the law of supply and demand, that there's a natural price, as he puts it, for commodities, and that natural price is going to reflect how much it costs to produce something, plus how much it costs to make a living producing that thing. So it's whatever the cost of production, so the rent of your land and the cost of your seeds if you're a farmer, the cost of your equipment, the whatever it is that it will cost you to bring it to market. All of that is wrapped into the natural price, along with enough little buffer, enough on top of that for a person to survive and to be reasonably comfortable by doing this for a living, by growing wheat, for instance. So he says there's a natural price, and the actual price might vary and be different from that, higher and lower, depending on whether that the supply that comes to the market is equal to the demand of the people who want to buy that good or not. So that if there's a lot of people looking to buy and not very many people coming to sell, then the price goes up. Because they could ask for more because they've got more buyers than they have goods to go around. And on the flip side, if 20 people show up all trying to sell wheat and only 10 people show up looking to buy wheat, then the price might have to come down because you don't want to take a complete loss. You want to sell your goods for something, but there aren't enough people looking to buy it in order to make sure that everybody who's selling can sell. So Adam Smith says supply and demand determines the actual price, but if it turns out that you can't sell wheat, for instance, for enough money to pay for what it costs plus make a living at it, what will happen is that this will balance out naturally. People will stop selling wheat. You'll get out of that business and sell something else or do something else to make a living. And so what happens is that the laws of nature, this supply and demand, will ultimately balance out the market on its own. And so the best way to manage the economy is not what Colbert and Louis XIV would have said. It's not mercantilism where the government should just interfere. Instead, the best way to manage the economy so the economy can flourish and do its best is something called laissez-faire. Let it be. Just let it do its own thing, and the laws of nature will cause it to come to its perfect balance. It'll cause it to come to its perfect spot. Now, Adam Smith does warn that monopolies are to be avoided. You have to be careful of people who are manipulating this system. So even you could talk about collusion as well, along with monopolies. If there's only one or two or three people who control all the wheat there is in France, then they don't have to, since they have control of the entire supply, they don't necessarily have to sell according to market forces. They can just set the price they want because you can't get it from anybody else. That's something Adam Smith warns about. He also talks about some of the problems, perhaps, if you're trying to apply the laws of supply and demand to something like grain production or milk production or anything along those lines, agriculture or linen production or anything along that line as well. There's a danger because goods can't be produced, especially agricultural goods, overnight. And so even though the market will balance itself out, as long as people are free to make their own choices, that's a big if, in the short term, there may be shortages or problems or crises in the meantime. And this is something Adam Smith doesn't perhaps make as clear as he should. And the reason this becomes historically important, of course, is because the King of France is going to be very influenced by Smith's ideas as well as others, and think about whether he should stop directly manipulating the prices of goods like wheat in France. He's going to do this, unfortunately, at a really bad time when this price of wheat starts skyrocketing because there's very low supply, because of bad harvests, a long story. And as a result, as the price goes up and people can't afford it, what Adam Smith does not talk about in his Wealth of Nations is the very real physical and political consequence of people not being able to get enough food, basic necessities, that kind of thing. And the fact is that in the case of there being food shortages or something along those lines, allowing the market to kind of balance itself out may be a terrible mistake because people can't afford to wait another season for wheat growers to come to the marketplace because they realize people are getting a good price on wheat. In the meantime, they're going to die or go into a massive rebellion. That's something that is a danger that has to be accounted for if you're going to try to implement Smith's ideas, and it's something the King of France doesn't account for. So anyway, if you read through the readings that you've got here, you'll see, in relatively dull language, I apologize for that, but it talks about the quantity is brought to market with effectual demand and no more, market price comes naturally, and you will get into some of the details of how things kind of go up or down depending on the various influences on the marketplace. So, Adam Smith, important, influential historical text, talks about supply and demand, advocates for laissez-faire capitalism, but it's something that the French Revolution in particular is going to illustrate some of the, I guess, shortcomings of really violently and clearly early on. Okay, our next text is the Declaration of Independence. The primary author of this is Thomas Jefferson. It's written in 1776 and issued by it's issued by the Second Continental Congress, and the goal of the Declaration is to express why the colonies want to break with Britain. And so in it, you see some language that should sound fairly familiar to you because it's an echo very strongly of some of the things we've already read, particularly John Locke. So for instance, everybody's familiar with this beginning here. When in the course of human events it becomes necessary for one people to dissolve the political bands which have connected them with another and assume among the powers of the earth the separate and equal station to which the laws of nature and nature's God entitle them, a decent respect to the opinions of mankind requires that they should declare the causes which impel them to the separation. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal. You've heard that with Locke and Hobbes and others' basic Enlightenment philosophical point, and that they're endowed by their Creator with certain unalienable rights, that among these are life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and that to secure these rights, governments are instituted among men, deriving their just powers from the consent of the governed. All of this is absolutely boilerplate Enlightenment philosophical text with one major exception. Jefferson here substitutes, instead of saying life, liberty, and property, the way that Locke would, he says life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Now this seems to be his own invention. Nobody else uses this formulation or this phrasing. We're not entirely clear why he does it that way, but he does. And really, it is your guess is as good as anyone's in terms of what motivates him. I have my own personal pet theory, but you shouldn't necessarily put too much stock in that. It's only my own idea. The rest of the Declaration of Independence goes on to express why it is Jefferson feels that the American colonists deserve to throw off the domination of Britain and declare themselves as an independent nation. And in it, he talks repeatedly about how the king has refused to pass laws for the accommodation of large districts of people, called together legislative bodies at places unusual, uncomfortable, and distant from the depository of their public records for the purpose of fatiguing them into compliance with his measures. He talks at length about representative houses. These are colonial legislatures that the king is interfering with. He talks about stationing standing armies, billeting troops. We talked about that in lecture as well. Billeting troops in people's homes, stationing standing armies among the colonies when there's no war that's going on. They're just there as security forces. He complains about that. He complains about Britain interfering with trade. He complains also, and this is an interesting point, and in my book it's the top of page 99, he has endeavored to prevent the population of these states, for that purpose obstructing laws of naturalization of foreigners, refusing to pass others to encourage their migration hither, and raising conditions of new appropriation of lands. Jefferson complains that the king is standing in the way of more immigration, of bringing more people into the colonies to increase their population. Part of what he's getting at is exactly what it sounds like. Jefferson wants the population of the United States to go up, so he wants people from Britain and elsewhere to be able to freely move into this territory. But also, what he complains about is the appropriation of new lands. Colonists and colonial legislatures were generally in favor of expanding territory, but that imperiled some of the treaty arrangements with Native Americans, particularly the Iroquois. And so the King of England tried to put a stop to this and is like, you can't just grab up more land. Treaties have to be negotiated. Things have to happen. You can't just do whatever you want. I don't want you doing that. And so he attempted to put the kibosh on it. And Jefferson complains about this as an overreach of power. And if you go through all the rest of these, he goes on to complain about all kinds of various offenses of the British government, but in each of these, if you read one by one, he complains about things that are very much typical of the jobs of government. It is absolutely usually the place of a king to determine what treaty organizations will be entered into. It is usually the place of a king to station troops places. It is the place of a king to determine what the border should look like and where it should be and how you should interact. It is the place of a king to govern immigration policy, and it is the place of a king traditionally to establish taxation. Everyone else in the world pays taxes. Up until this point, the colonies really hadn't been taxed because Britain provided very little in the way of services. But after the 7 Years' War, where Britain spent a ton of money sending troops and supplies and whatnot to defend their colonies, they foresee themselves changing that relationship. And Jefferson and others don't want that. Principally, it's not really about the money, principally because they don't want to give up their independence. They don't want to give up the control they've always enjoyed, making their own laws and doing their own thing. So, in the Declaration of Independence, Jefferson lists all of these abuses, and if he were in Britain, it would be almost laughable that these would be dismissed, because of course this is the kind of thing a king has the right to do. But Jefferson argues he doesn't have the right to do it in the colonies because in the colonies we have no representation in Parliament. In the colonies we're not part of British government, we're excluded from it, and so therefore he can't work like an ordinary government can. Now here's just a little side note. Jefferson, even though a great deal of the early resistance to the British rule and the early, I guess, revolutionaries, a lot of them organized around resistance to taxation, the Stamp Act and the Tea Act, for instance. Jefferson really doesn't talk about that in too much detail. He sort of briefly alludes to taxes and then kind of skims over it and talks about impressment into the Navy, which really upset people. That was a practice where the British would, because everyone is, if you sail on an American ship, the British argue, you're technically part of the British fleet. And so if the British Navy needed extra sailors, they would just kind of like stop ships and grab up people on other British ships and put them in the Navy, and congratulations, you're in the Navy now. This is a terrible practice because being in the Navy is like a half step from being in prison. It was a situation where you can't easily get out. You could be executed for trying to defect or run away, and it was not necessarily a great life. And so this is the kind of thing that really ticks people off. If they find out that the king is doing it. So Jefferson emphasizes stuff like that. Stationing troops, interfering with the legislatures, impressing people into the Navy. He emphasizes that, and he really skims over the whole property bit, that whole life, liberty, property. He skims over the taxation issue, mentions it, but really, really briefly, and then just moves on quickly to something else. My pet theory is that Jefferson is, by choosing to go with the pursuit of happiness and by skimming over the taxes, it creates almost a consistent view. He's trying to de-emphasize the role that money plays in motivating a lot of the leaders of the American Revolutionary Movement. And if you remember, many of the leaders of the American Revolutionary Movement were men of property. These are people who were rich. They had a lot going on. And so the Declaration of Independence, because it was meant to be kind of a propaganda tool, it would be circulated around the colonies, and everybody would see it and be like, yeah, those are good reasons to declare independence. It's an effort to deliberately de-emphasize the notion that the leaders of this movement might have selfish motives for wanting to promote independence from Britain. People like George Washington and Thomas Jefferson, who owned large plantations, they had a vested interest in wanting to not pay taxes to Britain more than the average person did, because they had a lot more at stake. They had a vested interest in maintaining independence of the legislatures because they were leading those legislatures. And so my pet theory, you don't have to agree with it, is that Jefferson is trying to make it look less self-interested than perhaps it might be, and that his choice of the phrase, the pursuit of happiness, is at least in part, an effort to try to make people not think so much about property and how property might actually be driving some of these choices. Okay, that's just my idea. Okay, so now we come to what is the Third Estate by the Abbé de Sieyès. The deal with him, Emmanuel Joseph de Sieyès is his name. He's a clergyman, and he's active in the Estates General in 1789. This is that moment right before the French really break out into open revolution, where the treasury is empty, the king is desperate, the royal family is terribly unpopular, and so they decide to summon the Estates General as a last-ditch effort to raise some money. And it backfires horribly because there's this huge fight in France about what should happen. And Abbé de Sieyès' pamphlet, which he circulates right before the meeting of the Estates General, advocates for what he sees as the best outcome here. He's going to take on the task of defining what the Third Estate is and argue that the Third Estate ought to have more role in determining the future of French politics. And so his text is really kind of designed at that. It's promoting the idea that now I guess I should probably summarize in case you haven't seen this week's lecture yet. The three estates traditionally that take part in the Estates General in France. The first estate is the clergy, the second is the nobility, and the third estate is everybody else. And that represents between 70 and 80% of the population. And yet traditionally, the third estate was always given one vote. So the clergy had one vote, the nobility had one vote, and everybody else had one vote. And they kept getting outvoted. That's what happened when the medieval Estates General were constantly called. And so in this new Estates General, the argument is made by Sieyès and others that it shouldn't work that way. that the vote should go by proportion of the population and not simply by estate, and that the third estate, the everybody else, ought to have some say in government. And he's going to pull on Enlightenment philosophy and language in order to make that case. Okay, so in the text, I'm going to read over just the first few lines just because they're fun. The plan of this pamphlet is very simple. We have 3 questions to ask. First, what is the third estate? And he answers that. Everything. Second, what has it been heretofore in the political order? And he answers that. Nothing. And third, what does it demand to become something therein? And I just like that formulation because you can almost chant it. What is the third estate? Everything. What do we got? Nothing. What do we want? Something. Anyway, Sieyès goes on and he explains what the third estate does. And it's relatively straightforward, but what he lays out is basically the idea that nobles are given all the plum jobs, but they're given them not because they have earned them or because they're the best people for them, but because they're the only people eligible. And that this is unfair, not only to the common people who might be better qualified to be, say, a diplomat or the governor of New France or something along those lines. But it's also unfair to France because we're not getting the best people. We're getting the son of whatever jerk was currently in that job. And that doesn't seem fair. Instead of promoting people because they're good, you promote people because of who they are, who they were born into. And that this is inevitably going to lead to a bunch of incompetent jerks. Just to paraphrase. He also explains what it is that the third estate does, and he breaks it down into several different categories. You've got private enterprise, he explains, and public functions. And the private enterprise, he talks about the various categories of people. The first category, really there's 4 classes, he says. The first category is earth and water furnish the raw material for man's needs. The first class will compromise all families engaged in agriculture. So of these 4 categories, the first are farmers. And then second, he talks about between the original sale of materials and their consumption or use, further workmanship, more or less manifold, adds these materials a second value. The second class is craftspeople, people who take wool, for instance, and make it into cloth. And then the third are merchants. That's pretty straightforward. And then the fourth, he talks about, this is often the most confusing for students as they read this text. In addition to these 3 classes, there is of industrious and useful citizens concerned with goods for consumption and use. A society needs many private undertakings and endeavors which are directly useful or agreeable to the individual. The 4th class includes from the most distinguished scientific and liberal professions to the least esteemed domestic services. Such are the labors which sustain society. The 4th class are service employees. So anybody from a housekeeper, somebody who's doing your cooking and cleaning, all the way up to doctors, lawyers, people who provide services to the public. That's that 4th class. And so this is what he defines. These are the people who make up the third estate. And according to Abbé de Sieyès, that's it. That's how a government is run. That's who the people are who actually run this society. And by spelling this all out, he's like, these people are all in the third estate, and yet they do all of the freaking work that makes government possible. They do all of the stinking work in this country. And what do they have in terms of political representation? Nothing. And that's a crying shame. That's Abbé de Sieyès' basic whole point. And ideas like his and pamphlets like his are going to directly influence the National Assembly so that when they get together and the Estates General actually forms, they're going to refuse to be silenced. They're going to break out, sign the tennis court oath, create the National Assembly, demand a constitution, create the French Revolution, in other words. So that's that. Then we have the Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen. This is bundled in your book. In my book, it's page 113. It's bundled up with Olympe de Gouges' Declaration of the Rights of Woman, which is not written at the same time. If you can see your blurb at the beginning there are 2 different dates. The Declaration of the Rights of Man and the Citizen is published in 1789. The National Assembly is the general official kind of author, although it has some specific authors that are going to be very active in putting it together. And it's issued to be It sort of comes in the same phase as the Declaration of Independence, the same stage of the French Revolution as the Declaration of Independence came in the American Revolution, but it's a really radically different text because, and I mentioned this in lecture, it talks about all of the rights, fundamentally, the Bill of Rights type rights, that all people are entitled to and should be entitled to under the law. Basically, this is a blueprint that any new constitution that the French are going to come up with has to respect and has to obey. That before, that is basically, this is, they're laying it out. They're like, this is what people are entitled to. So there's a little bit of a blurb at the beginning where it gets into some very Enlightenment language, classic. And then you get into the Declaration of the Rights of Man, and they're numbered in your text. So on my page 114, you see the first one. Men are born and remain free and equal in rights. Social distinctions may be founded only on the general good. This is a declaration basically that nobility and noble titles should be abolished. Things like absolute monarchy really shouldn't exist. And then it goes on to say, the aim of all political association, this is number 2, is the preservation of the natural and imprescriptible rights of man. These are liberty, property, security, and resistance to oppression. So this too is a change from Locke. It's not just life, liberty, and property, but it goes on to say liberty, property, security, and resistance to oppression, life already being defined. So the French, I just want to point this out, are going to go a little further than even John Locke did in his second treatise of government, and certainly their approach is going to be very different than we saw with the French or with the American Revolution. In the American Revolution, there was just a laundry list of complaints about the things the king had been doing specifically, couched in some Enlightenment rhetoric. And they don't get around to expressing the idea that individual rights are the whole purpose of government and defining what those rights are until really late in the process. The French are going to start with that, and they're going to emphasize not just your right to live as you would or to be free as you want to be free and to have your own property and security, but you also have the right to resistance to oppression. They're defining right from the outset that people have the right to violently rebel. And this is a very different outlook from what you saw with the American Revolution. They too, in the American version, are going to assume they have a right to violently rebel because they do violently rebel, but usually within the context. There's very little rioting. Instead, it's within the context of kind of an organized, politically led movement by people who really have no interest in seeing society overturned. That's not what you find in the French version. And the Declaration of the Rights of Man are going to emphasize that and they're going to emphasize this notion of trying to create social equality and social rights as well. So he goes on, there's a bunch of specifics here. Law is the expression of the general will. It gets into all the things you would associate with the Bill of Rights. No person shall be accused, arrested, imprisoned, except in cases and according to the forms prescribed by law. No arbitrary orders shall be respected. The law shall provide for such punishments as are only strictly and obviously necessary. So no arrest without good reason, and there's no cruel and unusual punishment. People are innocent until proven guilty. Freedom of expression. Freedom of speech, if you will, freedom of the press, freedom, general security, and the right to decide personally or by the representatives as to the necessity of public contribution. Here he talks about taxes and says that the French have a right to know where their tax money goes, to have a free and transparent accounting, and that nobody should have to pay taxes unless those taxes have been approved by a representative government. So all of this stuff gets spelled out, and in it the French really show themselves in their revolutionary movement to be much more socially progressive and much more interested in trying to achieve protections for individual rights. Okay. Olympe de Gouges, if you were going to kind of match that up, is going to very much echo deliberately the language of the Declaration of the Rights of Man, but she's going to take on that same problem that the women who marched to Versailles do. She's upset that the Declaration of the Rights of Man falls short because they don't explicitly specify that women too are included. Now, you could read the Declaration of the Rights of Man as meaning mankind or humanity, if you will, but Deguge is upset because she's like, it really should say specifically that these legal protections extend to women as well. And so she, in her pamphlet, is going to deliberately echo the language of the Declaration of the Rights of Man, but she's going to jazz it up, especially at the beginning, at the end, with a complaint, a diatribe, if you will, complaining about the general unfairness of the condition of women and how women have been treated badly. And so she's going to go on and say it's just science, women need to be protected as well. And then in her Declaration of the Rights of Women and Female Citizen, you're going to see that in most cases it more or less directly echoes the Declaration of the Rights of Man. Woman is born free and lives equal to man in her rights. Social distinctions may be based only on the common utility. It's the same thing it said in the French version of the Declaration of the Rights of Man, except that it says women. There are going to be a few places where there is a difference, and those are worth pointing out, so I guess I will point them out. She is going to emphasize, in some places, the same rights that you would find in the Declaration of Rights of Man. For instance, Articles 7, 9, and 10. But she's going to emphasize perhaps different reasons or motivations. For instance, in Article 7, no woman is an exception. She is accused, arrested, and detained in cases determined by law. Women, like men, obey this rigorous law. Article 9, once any woman is declared guilty, complete rigor is to be exercised by the law. What Deguge is getting at here is her intent that women be recognized as legally equal to men. And in the current status, in the situation in 1789, she is living in a France where that is not the case. Not only do women not have equal rights, so they don't have equal right to control their property, for instance, they don't have equal kind of freedom of movement, especially when it comes to their husbands making decisions about whether they can and can't go places, that kind of thing. They don't have equal rights to attend in educational institutions, that kind of thing. But they also are not treated equally under the law in the cases of crimes. So that if a woman commits a crime, she very often would be given a lighter penalty, or sometimes her husband would be held accountable, or something along those lines. Deguge is deliberately drawing a distinction and saying, no, women should be treated equally under the law, both in its rights and its demands. So if you break the law, women should be treated exactly with the same severity as men, because they should be given equal protection by the law as well. They should have equal right to control their property. They should have equal right to come and go as they please. They should have equal protections and equal obligations. Then in Article 10, she specifically says that basically she spells this out. No one is to be disquieted for his very basic opinions. Woman has the right to mount the scaffold, so women can climb up the scaffold and be beheaded by the guillotine or hanged. She must equally have the right to mount the rostrum. That would be the place where you would make a public speech from. So Deguge makes this very direct connection. She's like, if women are going to be judged by the law, they should also be free according to the law to do anything that a man is legally able to do. Okay, and then in Article 11, she gets into free communication of thoughts and opinions. She's going to expand on that, and she's going to point out a problem that was a social concern for women at this time and is going to be for some time forward. Free communication of thoughts and opinions is one of the most precious rights of women, since that liberty assures the recognition of children by their fathers. Any female citizen thus may say freely, I am the mother of a child which belongs to you, without being forced by a barbarous prejudice to hide the truth. An exception may be made to respond to the abuse of this liberty in cases determined by law. Deguge is here pointing out one of the major, I guess, terrible social injustices that afflict working class women in particular, especially those who are forced into domestic service. Now, we referred to this in lecture a week or two ago, where when there's this massive wave as a result of industrialization, there's this massive wave of unemployed people, partly because of population increase, partly because you didn't need as many people to work in agriculture because of changes. And so you had all these people looking for work, and one of the places you could get work is hiring yourself out as a domestic servant for really cheap. And because there's so many people looking for work, you could hire people basically for slave wages. You'd have somebody and pay them almost nothing or next to nothing or sometimes nothing. And instead of giving them decent wages, you would give them room and board in your house. So you'd have a little room where they would live and then you'd feed them. And that was basically what you paid your maid or your footman or whatever. Footman usually paid a little bit more. But at any rate, you had a lot of young women from the countryside moving into the city, desperate for work, in absolutely a vulnerable situation. If they get fired, especially without any kind of a reference, they are going to be thrown out on the street to be a prostitute or starve to death. I mean, really, those are their options. So they are in a terribly, horribly vulnerable situation where they can easily be taken advantage of by members of the families that employ them. And so in this situation, if women were to get pregnant, they would immediately be fired. And if they were to go to one of these fine, upstanding, well-to-do people who'd employed them in the first place and say, hey, it would be nice to have some child support here, since you knocked me up, kicked me out, lost my job, etc., not only would they have almost no legal ability to enforce that, they'd have no chance of ever winning a paternity suit in this case, because the father could simply deny it and then there'd be no proof. There's no DNA testing. But also, the person accused of parenting their child, or fathering the child, could then bring charges against the woman accusing him for libel and slander and have her thrown into jail. So this was a major problem, and as a result of that, there was a huge upswelling in abandoned infants. Orphanages had to be founded all over the place because babies were being left on church steps and all over the place because people had them and couldn't make a living with a baby in tow. And it was just awful. So Olympe de Gouges points that out, and it's just a little reference to that situation. So the rest of it, what you see in the Declaration of the Rights of Women is something that is very much worth noting. This is from 1791, and what Olympe de Gouges here is asking for is legal equality for women, recognition that women have as much capacity to do things and serve in jobs and be in positions as men. She's asking basically for what would be 100% consistent with sort of modern feminist ideology, but it's 1791, and she's not unusual. There was a massive women's movement, women's rights movement in the French Revolution. In the end, this is going to be, even though it was quite broadly accepted in France in 1790s, it's going to end up backfiring badly. Because the French Revolution is going to take that radical turn and they're going to start killing everybody, it's going to be the reign of terror, these women's movement ends up being kind of lumped in with the changes of the Radical Revolution and end up looking either ridiculous or monstrous to places like Britain, and they're going to resist much harder the idea of women being granted the vote or being granted kind of legal emancipation than they might have otherwise. In essence, the sort of violent turn of the French Revolution is going to end up kind of stabbing the women's movement in the back, as it were. But I just wanted to point out for everybody who's read this text just how progressive Olympe de Gouges' goals were and how realistic they were for her own time. So 1791, strong women's movement. It's not going to actually come to anything in most of Europe and certainly the Americas until much later, in part because of the backlash against the French Revolution. Speaking of backlash, we have Edmund Burke. Edmund Burke is going to be a British, that's probably tell by the name, he's going to be a British philosophical writer, and he's going to write during the French Revolution in 1790, before it really gets bad. But he's going to write reflections on the revolution in France, and I suppose I should back up and explain a little bit. Burke is known as the founder of modern philosophical conservatism. Conservative is one of those words like liberal that gets thrown around in a relative sense to talk about whether you are more, more liberal or more conservative when you talk about modern politics. That's not what Edmund Burke is all about. When I say conservatism, there is a specific philosophy that he's associated with, that doesn't really have any bearing on American politics. It used to have absolutely no bearing. I say that with confidence. Sadly, I don't know that that's entirely true anymore, but basically, if you believe in representative government at all, if you think people should have the right to vote for their government, you are not an Edmund Burke conservative. What Edmund Burke argues is, and this is what conservative philosophy is in a capital C way, conservative philosophy argues that you can trust tradition, you can trust traditional institutions, things like monarchy, things like the church with a capital C. Those are the sorts of things you can trust to run a government. But ordinary people can't be trusted because they're stupid, and they'll make stupid choices, and they're easily manipulated, and they're dumb, and they're inherently incapable of running a government. And so therefore, the best government is the one that appeals to institutions of the past. When we talk about conservatism in a relative sense, that typically is what we mean. We're talking about people who are in favor of keeping things the same, or perhaps going back to a more traditional way of doing things. In American politics, that usually meant, it usually associated with things like limited government and so forth. In British politics of 1790, what that means is a hardcore royalist. That's what Burke was. And he's going to straight up argue that the ideas of the American and French Revolution are just offensive and stupid and wrong. And so he's going to make these arguments in some quite colorful ways. For instance, and this is a quote that's not from your reading, but the occupation of a hairdresser or working tallow chandler is a person who makes candles, cannot be a matter of honor to any person, to say nothing of a number of other more servile employments. Such men ought not suffer oppression by the state, but the state suffers oppression if such as they, either individually or collectively, are permitted to rule. In other words, if you are a working class person, you are not the same quality as a person who is noble, and so therefore a government that is run either individually or collectively, that means whether there is a sort of a democracy and people who are working class get to vote, or whether you were to raise a working class person to rule, that government is corrupted, that government is basically oppressed by the rule of people who are fundamentally low quality. That's Edmund Burke's overall outlook. And in his reflection in our reading on the Revolution in France, he is going to go off on the French and talk, basically he's going to whine and complain about how the French have ruined their chance, and how if they didn't like absolute monarchy, they could at least have gone with a sort of a better form of monarchy. And he just goes on and on and on. I'm not going to quote too much out of here just because it's relatively straightforward. But he talks about how, and when he keeps saying you, he uses the second person. It's like, you have done this, you have done that. He's addressing France. Okay, so you would have had a protected, satisfied, laborious, and obedient people taught to seek and recognize the happiness that is to be found by virtue in all conditions, in which consists the true moral equality of mankind. This is the bottom of the first column of 119 in my book, and the top of the second column. Edmund Burke argues that there may be moral equality between people, but there's no real equality in the way that Locke and other Enlightenment philosophers would argue. And not, he goes on, in that monstrous fiction which, by inspiring false ideas and vain expectations into men destined to travel an obscure walk of laborious life, serves only to aggravate and embitter that real inequality which it can never remove. That's exactly what I was just talking about there. Edmund Burke argues in his text that inequality between working class people and noble people is real, and that it can't ever be removed. And all you're doing with this talk of revolution is getting people all worked up for nothing, and they're just going to be angry and bitter, and are just going to be more difficult to deal with than they would have been before, because you will never make a society that is equal, and it's stupid to try. He goes on. there are other little clues in here. He goes into France, and there's a whole bunch of exclamation points. You can see where he gets into his really worked up phase. France has bought undisguised calamities at a higher price than any nation has purchased the most unequivocal blessings. France has bought poverty by crime. France has not sacrificed her virtue to her interest. She has abandoned her interest that she might prostitute her virtue. He uses a lot of language like that, in which he portrays France as a person and then basically says that she's screwing herself over, and that she's decided, France is a woman here, that she's decided to prostitute her virtue, and get nothing out of it, that the revolution, and this is, even though Burke is on the extreme end, his ideas were not considered that out there. There were definitely people who agree with him, lots of people who agree with him, and there are a lot of people who think he has a point, and especially as the revolution in France starts to take a turn and get more and more violent, there are many people who side with Burke and say, look, France had this revolution, but what did they accomplish by it? All the great goals and plans that they had don't come to pass. And yet they have all this violence and disorder and disruption and suffering and deprivation of war. And so they're not really getting anything. It's useless, and they're not accomplishing what they hope to accomplish. So Burke's ideas are going to get a bit of traction. You can see his general idea about gender, and you can probably guess as to his notion of how he would feel about the women's movement, based on his horror of even working class people being able to vote. The idea of women having any kind of equal place in society he doesn't even entertain the notion. But he does portray women, basically France as a woman who's prostituting her virtue, and then he's going to go on. There's a telling little line here on page 119. All other people have laid the foundations of civil freedom in severe manners and a system of more austere and masculine morality. France, when she let loose the reins of regal authority, doubled the license of a ferocious dissoluteness in manners and of an insolent irreligion in opinions and practices, and has extended through all ranks of life, as if she were communicating some privilege or laying open some secluded benefit, all the unhappy corruptions that were usually the disease of wealth and power. This is one of the new principles of equality in France. His phrasing of virtue as masculine and, I guess, bad behavior as feminine is probably telling. Okay, then he gets into what's unnatural, blah, 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 blah. He goes on and on. Okay, inconsiderate, presumptuous, unresisted, and irresistible authority, blah, 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 blah. So, you can probably get a good idea of Edmund Burke and what he's all about just by that. It's pretty straightforward. He's eminently quotable. He really gets worked up about it. His language is somewhat flowery, but it's a little bit easier to understand because it's less abstract than somebody like John Locke. So it should be fairly straightforward for you. Okay, so that's it. Next time with our reading roundup, we're going to pick up from here and we're going to talk about the radicals. Up until now, we've had a little bit of discussion about revolutionary philosophy, but we're going to talk about some of the major opponents to Edmund Burke's perspective, and people who are going to argue on the other side of the fence next time. So that was that. I hope it was helpful. Thanks a lot.